Okay.
See you, Jane, and then I'm going to sit at the end. You're going to sit here and do your thing, okay?
Okay.
Do you want us to speak from here or speak
Whatever
from
you
there?
prefer. But if you're making remarks, speaking from here might be better.
Whatever you want. Okay. Okay. That's good.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. If you are not already in a comfortable seat, please take a comfortable seat. You'll be delighted that we turned the temperature down in Washington for an Arctic meeting. It's a nippy temperature out there. My name is Laura Dawson. I'm the director of the Canada Institute, and I'm delighted to kick off this program, and I am delighted to introduce Representative Jane Harman, the president of the Wilson Center, who's going to open up this first panel for us.
Okay. Thank you, Laura. Welcome, everyone, bright and early, and welcome to two of the best senators, both of whom display bipartisanship, problem-solving skills, and friendliness to the Wilson Center. And to me personally, what else do you need? I'd like to especially welcome, in addition to all of our smart people who show up at the Wilson Center to listen to our programs, several VIPs. Admiral Papp, who's the senior U.S. representative for the Arctic, sitting right in front here. Meade Treadwell, who is the former Lieutenant Governor of Alaska and a very close friend of the Wilson Center. Alice Rogoff, where's Alice? In the back. Alice is in the back. Passionate lover of the Arctic, owner of the Alaska Dispatch, and I had thought that she rode a dog sled around the Iditarod race recently, but no, that wasn't good enough for Alice. She flew her plane. She flew her plane around the 1,000 miles, Alice? Each way? The 2,000 miles so that it would be adequately covered for the Alaska Dispatch, right? And the article will be distributed here soon? Oh, has been. Okay. Well, events like this, not just the Iditarod race, remind me why the Wilson Center matters. It's not just that we do the deep dive on issues in the news, like ISIL, encryption, and Iran. It's not just that we have breadth from Russia to Brazil and back. We're at our best when, every once in a while, the stars align and we spot a new priority emerging across our areas of expertise. That's why in the think tank ratings, we were ranked this year's #1 top think tank for transdisciplinary research. That's why we launched our Polar Initiative, because we saw an opportunity to frame the intersecting issues that will shape the future of the Arctic. And that's why we're thrilled to host the Arctic Economic Development Forum today. We have all the right stakeholders in the room. And thanks to Senators Murkowski and King for joining us. They are the co-chairs, the bipartisan, well, I don't know what you are. You're what are you?
He's a Democrat. I'm the chair of the Independent Caucus.
Okay, they're the Independent Republican. Oh, wait a minute. Lisa ran as an independent, too, in the last write-in candidate. Write-in candidate.
I'm the chair.
They're the extraordinarily interesting hybrid co-chairs of the Arctic Caucus. And these issues matter intensely to them and matter intensely to Alaska and Maine and the other 48 states. Lisa and Angus are also very close to a dearest friend of mine, Maine Senior Senator Susan Collins. And all three of them grace the Wilson Center on regular occasions. We were happy to have Senator Murkowski here just a few weeks ago when the International Maritime Organization rolled out a new polar code. As she knows, this area is a key priority. And today we're going to talk about the building blocks of a stronger Arctic. Virtually everyone here is a stakeholder in this. And this event has been in the works for a while, drawing on resources across the center, like our Canada and Kennan Institutes. It kicks off a renewed commitment to the High North. So stay tuned, because we have more programming planned for this space. In the months ahead, expect to hear from us on issues from icebreakers and investment to education and technology. We're redoubling our effort to look at the Arctic from every angle. And finally, our thanks to the Institute of the North for partnering with us on today's event. They're driving some critical policy conversations, and we're thrilled to help elevate those issues here in Washington. In that spirit, please join me in welcoming Senators Lisa Murkowski and Angus King.
Well, I've been tasked to go first this morning. I think we're doing it alphabetically, going from Alaska to Maine. But it's a pleasure to be here with Senator King as co-chair of the Arctic Caucus. Jane, thank you for the welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to be back at the Wilson Center and talking about priorities. You know, you say that the Wilson Center identifies these emerging priorities. There are a few of us, and I'm looking at some of the guys in the front row here that have been banging the table for a long while saying, priority, 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 let's move it on the Arctic. And so it is good when we are able to gather and remind people about why from the U.S. perspective, the Arctic must be a priority. I'd like to welcome some friends that I have worked with over the years through the Arctic Parliamentarian Conference. I've been a member of the Standing Committee on the Arctic Parliamentarians pretty much since I came to the United States Senate. And it was a gathering, it's an annual gathering or several times a year, where I would have my professional colleagues from other nations say, so when is the United States going to step into the game here? And as we have continued those friendships and those relationships, the feedback that I'm getting from other Arctic nations is we're seeing it. We're seeing it. The United States is engaging. The United States is there, but it has taken more than a little bit of time. So again, welcome to my friends from the Arctic Parliamentarians Conference and the Institute of the North for coordinating this, Nils. We appreciate what you are doing. We talk so much at home about the excitement, what is happening within the Arctic, the potential for shipping within the region, what that does not only for us in the northern Arctic, the U.S. Arctic, and what our prospects are, whether it's engagement with building a deep water port, whether it's the necessity to move forward on icebreakers for the nation, the interest, the prospects in terms of the geologic resources that are there, whether it's the oil or the critical minerals, the rare earths that are there. Again, the draw to the Arctic to me is obvious, and we stand up here and we say the United States is an Arctic nation. Pay attention, pay attention. But if you're from Iowa or if you are from Nebraska, it's tough for you to make that connect that somehow or other we are an Arctic nation outside of Alaska or Maine. So what we've been trying to do within the Arctic Caucus is to remind colleagues, remind states what the significance is. Whether it's from trade, with nearly 20% of the U.S. exports going to the 7 other Arctic nations, whether it's the research activity, and this is where I think we get a little bit more attention from folks. With the National Science Foundation having provided Arctic research grants to entities based in 44 different states plus the District of Columbia. A lot of times people forget that. I like to remind my colleague from Iowa who doesn't think about the Arctic very much that it's there at the University of Northern Iowa that they have a very specific Arctic research program. So it's good to tell him, you're part of an Arctic nation. And it's then the national security issues that really touch every corner of the country. But oftentimes we here in the Congress are listening to the discussions about the Arctic, and it seems that it is so focused, so targeted towards specifically and oftentimes exclusively the issues of climate. about climate change, about environmental protections, and really about limitations on our economic growth or our economic potential, as if economic activity were the primary cause of climate change. And so I think it's good when we get into discussions and dialogue about economic development in the context of the Arctic rather than restrictions on our opportunities. We use lots of analogies here. I've said that oftentimes people view the Arctic as this snow globe that just sits up on a shelf and it looks pretty, but don't touch it, just hands off. We had a hearing before the Energy and Natural Resources Committee last year, and it was commented by some colleagues that it was ironic that Alaska should support any kind of oil and gas development, basically extraction opportunities, because we are so significantly impacted by climate change. We see it. In my view, there's no debate up there. But yet at the same hearing, we heard from a native leader who said that thanks to oil and gas development, we had seen, or they had seen up in the community of Barrow, 200 years of economic development and advancement over a period of 30 years. Thanks to opportunities for economic development, you'd taken a community that had been truly a subsistence-only community and bring to them the amenities of modern life, whether it's water and sewer, whether it's heating, whether it's power. But think about that, 200 years of economic development and activity compressed into a 30-year period. So, the pushback in saying, is this an ironic situation? What would be ironic, what would be bad, is if we were to deliberately limit the economic future of our native people, of our indigenous people, by somehow claiming, look, it's good for your own benefit that we don't do any development up here. This is going to be good for you because it's going to help the rest of the country. Well, tell that to a community that lives in a cold, oftentimes very harsh environment. Tell them that it's good for them, that their access to heat, to power, to education, to clean water, sanitation facilities. What we have now up on the North Slope is access to medical facilities, medical clinics that allow the people there a healthy standard of living. They've improved telecommunications, the search and rescue capacity and capability helps the hunting parties when they go out. You think about what we take here for granted, the modern amenities like a simple flush toilet. That's pretty basic stuff, and so I think it's important to keep that in mind. And you think about what happens to a community and a culture that is able to see what is going on the outside, but not able to derive any of those opportunities for themselves. All of a sudden, or perhaps not all of a sudden, but what you then see is, well, wait a minute. We're in the United States of America too. It's not that we're looking for street lights and sidewalks, but we want some of the basic amenities. And so that stress, that tension is something that I think is important to be recognized. I have mentioned, and I know for many of you in the room, you've heard me mention it many times, that you effectively have two different Arctics. You have the Arctic in the Nordic countries that have developed infrastructure, whether it's the road systems, the power grids, the opportunities for individuals in more urban settings. But then you have the Arctic that we see in Alaska, in Canada, in Greenland, parts of Russia, where you lack that basic infrastructure. And so I think it's important to recognize that what is needed in the North American Arctic is not necessarily or always the same as what we have in the Nordic Arctic. And so I kind of approach this in saying we need to be focusing on regional development within the Arctic as a whole, and recognizing that when we're trying to create economies of scale, you've got to take a holistic approach to how we attract investment. The goal for sustainable communities to really allow them a lifestyle and a level that is acceptable and workable for them. You can't look at kind of a sector-specific or a single-issue focus. So whether it's economic development, whether it's research activities, whether it's investment in our infrastructure or environmental stewardship, everything's interlinked here. And so make sure that we're looking at this more holistically, but again, on a regional approach. And recognize that what happens then within one part of the community impacts another. We're trying to help facilitate a deep water port off of Nome, or a series of port systems in the Arctic. And you might have a tendency to just look at that port and say, well, this is going to help benefit the shipping industry. Of course it will. But think about what it does for that community of Nome, for instance, and the surrounding communities that where Nome serves as the regional hub for this area, for about 50 different villages. Well, if you can bring in fuel to be staged there in Nome, what that allows you to do to help all of the other small villages in the region have lower cost to their fuel, have lower cost to their food sources. So don't just view this as a port for shipping necessarily, but view it as that infrastructure that allows for so much more. I want to close my comments and turn to my colleague by leaving you with a comment that came from one of our leaders up in the Arctic Slope region, Richard Glenn. Richard has been a speaker at many of the Arctic conferences, but we had an energy field hearing up in Fairbanks, and assessing and looking at the natural resource development in the state of Alaska. And Richard noted the importance of creating an alignment between the landowner, which is often the indigenous populations, and the explorer when it comes to economic development. And the way the success of the explorer then becomes a success for the community's residents. And it was an important reminder to us that you think about those people who are living in our Arctic environments. Most of them, I think it's fair to say, probably don't have master's degrees. But what they do have is they have a master's in Arctic living. They know more about what goes on in that region than any scientist that you're going to be bringing in from NSF or those around the outside here. And so utilizing that experience, that know-how in all aspects of planning moving forward, whether it's natural resource, whether it's business development plans, anyone seeking to do business in the state or in the Arctic needs to be viewing this as an opportunity. Use these human resources, this human capital. So I've kind of wandered all over. I know we're going to have an opportunity this afternoon for further panel, but I do want to acknowledge before I conclude the role that Tara Sweeney is playing as the chair of the Arctic Economic Council, as an entity that really seeks to pair up the needs with the resources. What we're seeing coming out of the AEC, I think, is exciting. We recognize that it's still in its early formative years, but if we can figure out the way that we harness and utilize the knowledge and experience that the members bring to it, this is important, and this will be an ongoing and a lasting contribution. So with that, I'm going to turn to my colleague, Senator King from Maine, and then we'll go back and forth on our questions. Thanks, Jane.
I'm going to stay here. I'm going to have to leave a little early. I apologize. There is only one group of people in Washington this morning who's more important than you. It's my constituents who come every Wednesday morning for coffee with me at my office. So you just have to, we all have our priorities. Every Wednesday morning we have coffee and blueberry cake for anybody from Maine that's in Washington, families or people at conferences. So I have to go over for
So if some of you are from Maine, you can leave
Yeah,
with
you can
Senator
go.
King.
It was sort of fun to think about how to frame some brief remarks. Potential problems and promise. Potential problems and promise. Here's the potential: energy and natural resources, transit and trade, international cooperation, security, and infrastructure development. Those are the potentials that I see in the Arctic region. Here are the problems: energy and natural resources, transit and trade, international cooperation, security, and infrastructure. The problems and the promise are the problems and the potential are essentially the same. The solutions, the promise, all involve those issues. Energy. The United States can say we're not going to drill, but it's an international region. Other people are. So if we're going to have, and there are tremendous energy resources up there, there's also other natural resources, fisheries and the like. If we're going to be able to safely and environmentally, in a sound way, develop those resources, it's going to take some international standards, some common standards, because let's say we decide we are going to drill and we're going to have very rigorous environmental standards based upon our experience here in the United States, and the guys across the way in the same body of water decide they don't want to do it to that level of response and responsibility. The environment suffers. So we can't just say no energy development because we don't have the power to say that. There are plenty of other people up there that are going to say, well, we're going to go in this direction. The same thing with fisheries in terms of the exploitation of fisheries over time. It's got to be done in a responsible way, and that requires some level of cooperation and development of standards. Transit is obviously one of the great factors in this opening up of the Arctic. I contend that the opening of the Arctic, because of the melting of the ice, is the equivalent of the discovery of the Mediterranean Sea. It's the discovery of an entirely new major water body in the world, bordered by a whole bunch of countries with different interests. It's a very significant development, and transit is going to be a big part of it. Now, it's not yet, but it will be probably over the next 20 to 30 years, and it's already becoming more and more used on the northern route, which happens to run along the coast of Russia, and the Northwest Passage, which is a more southerly route towards Canada and the U.S., is going to take longer to develop just because of the extent of the ice. By the way, parenthetically, why am I here? My initial interest was when I realized that as transit develops through this route, the ports in Maine, Eastport, Searsport, and Portland, are the nearest ports on the east coast of the United States to ships transiting through the Arctic. And historically, countries and communities that sit astride trade routes prosper. And we see this as tremendous potential, and we already are starting to see some of this potential. We've had an Icelandic company, Aimskip, has put its North American headquarters, an Icelandic shipping company, has put its North American headquarters in Portland and is significantly expanding that development. So trade and transit are potentials. There are problems, but the solution is that we're going to have to continue to work together and develop the infrastructure. And I mentioned infrastructure. That's one of my items, including icebreakers. Icebreakers are the highway builders of the Arctic. That's what they are. It's just like a road grader and a bulldozer. That's what an icebreaker is. And the good news is the president, when he was in Alaska last summer, said we're going to build a new icebreaker. The good news is there was money in the budget, proposed in the president's budget, for at least starting the design and engagement of the private sector in the development of a new icebreaker. The bad news is it's not a new icebreaker. It's a replacement icebreaker. By the time this new icebreaker is built, the old icebreaker will be retired or damn close to it. Perhaps there might even be a couple of years gap between the time we have to retire the Polar Star and the time the new icebreaker comes online, if the schedule is met. So it's not a new icebreaker. It's simply a replacement of a retiring icebreaker. And I think we need to be thinking about one or two more. We were at a conference in Iceland last year. By the way, whoever thought of the Cayman Islands as part of Arctic? But I couldn't resist that. Sorry. That was bad, wasn't it?
You were on a roll.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But the Russians are just, they're in the process of building, I think, 3 or 4 new nuclear-powered icebreakers, and they have already a dozen, depending on how you count them. I've seen numbers up to 40. It depends on what you count as an icebreaker. But the point is, we really are woefully under-infrastructured when it comes to icebreakers. Security. I mentioned security as one of these issues. This is a really serious issue. The Russians, as we know, are doing a lot of military development along their border, along their shore of the Arctic. Air, naval, ground, radar, a lot of development, and the challenge is recognizing this as a potential international flashpoint, and how do we avoid the militarization of the Arctic and the potential for conflict. Now that brings me to one of the things I mentioned as both a potential and as a problem, and that is international cooperation. One of the things in terms of, and that's why it's so important to develop this region in a cooperative and international way. And it would be nice to start with the United States acceding to the UN Law of the Sea Treaty. Right now, Russia is up there. They're litigating claims along the shore in terms of where the continental shelf is, where the lines are, where the international waters start, where the national waters end, and we're on the sidelines. We're just not in the game. We're standing outside the courtroom watching, and it's ridiculous. And there's this theory abroad in the land that every international treaty is an abrogation of sovereignty. Well, okay, but my thinking is that it's like the homely stoplight. When you drive up to the light on the corner of 14th and Pennsylvania Avenue, there's a stoplight. If the light's red, you have to stop. That's an infringement on your sovereignty. It's an infringement. I'm serious. It's an infringement on your right to drive through that intersection. But by giving up the right and only driving through when it's green, you've gained something, which is the right to drive through the intersection without the likelihood of being killed. And a lot of people don't get this, that we gain sometimes by giving up something. And if we gain access to international tribunals to settle these disputes in terms of where the South China Sea is or where the continental shelf is in the Arctic, we are shooting ourselves in the foot. We are losing more than we're giving up. And you think about the analogy of the stoplight, because you can often gain more by giving up some of your sovereignty than you necessarily lose. So this business of no treaty which abrogates any scintilla of national sovereignty is a mistaken notion, because it ends up costing us more in terms of our national well-being, and I would argue our sovereignty. Energy and environment, transit and trade, international cooperation, the Arctic Circle, the Arctic Council, the United Nations, the law of the sea, bilateral agreements. National security has to be done in a responsible way, and the replacement icebreaker. I mean, those are some of the issues that I think we need to talk about. This is an incredibly important area. You know that. That's why you're here, and it's an incredible opportunity. It's an opportunity because we are opening up, think again to the Mediterranean Sea, we are opening up this very significant body of water at a time when hopefully we are to the point where we can work cooperatively between nations. We have the institutions in place, and we can deal with some of these issues without having to fight the Peloponnesian War and all of the struggles that went on over and still are going on over the Mediterranean Sea or any other body of water that lies between significant numbers of countries. So this is I think, a great opportunity. It's an opportunity for the United States to lead, not to dominate, but to lead. And I think it's something that we can benefit our public by, as Lisa says, not only the states and regions that are directly touch the Arctic, but all of the people of our country and the Arctic nations, and, as Lisa so eloquently pointed out, the people who already live there, the indigenous people who lead in many ways very tough lives, and who have as much right as we do to participate in the life of the 21st century, and yet we have to be sure it's done in a responsible and both environmentally and internationally responsible way. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you both very much. I don't know, Senator King, do you have to leave, or can you stay for a few minutes?
Stay for a while.
All right. I'm apologizing to your constituents for you, but it's very valuable to hear you talk about this. Just as a couple of comments, and I'll ask one question and then turn it over to Laura for a few more if there's time. But first comment is, many people think our Congress is dysfunctional and doesn't do its job. In some ways it is dysfunctional and doesn't do its job, but when you listen to these two senators talk so knowledgeably about this issue, you have to believe there are people up there, and there are people up there who do their job. So I just wanted to commend both of you for that. Alice Rogoff, again, still hiding in the back, calls the Arctic America's third ocean. You might think about adopting that rather than the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, this is an ocean, and it can be a shipping lane, as I understand it, between Asia and Europe, in addition to among the countries that border it. So the potential is just enormous. My question, just one, in the security lane, since that was my focus in Congress for 9 terms and still is here, is could I draw you both out a little more on the security issues? I mean, Russia is one of the countries bordering this third ocean. And as you said, Angus, it is militarizing, or at least increasing its military assets there. What are the, let's turn this around. What are the opportunities for cooperating with Russia that would hopefully minimize our getting into a situation like the situation in the South China Sea, which we don't border, but where the Chinese are militarizing what we consider and most of the world considers to be territory beyond their shores. And they're not building on islands, they're building on rocks and shoals, and those don't count as Chinese territory. What are the opportunities for cooperating with Russia?
Well, we are cooperating with Russia. I mentioned the Arctic parliamentarians just a few moments ago, a body of lawmakers, parliamentarians, coming together to discuss the issues of important to the 8 Arctic nations. And it's forums like that, it's forums like the Arctic Council, where we do try to put the controversial issues off the table and focus on those areas of cooperation. The Arctic has been described as the zone of peace. Perhaps it's not always that way, but I think it is fair to suggest that this is an area where you don't have 1,000 years of religious war going on there that you've got to cut through in order to have a dialogue or a conversation. I think, as Angus has mentioned, you have areas in common on the top of the globe, that there is a recognition that even though the Arctic nations have their respective borders, they share that border of the ocean itself, the ice, the ocean, just again the cap of the world. And so there needs to be greater consensus, greater collaboration. It's not always easy, but it gives us a venue to do so. It gives us a springboard. And I think the efforts that we are seeing through Arctic Council, through standing committees like the Arctic parliamentarians, this is where you build those relationships. This is where you say, we might not agree in certain areas here, but what are we doing to share research? What are we doing to come together with protocols as they relate to search and rescue or oil spill prevention and recovery? So there are platforms out there. It's not easy, but I think that we have in place the opportunity to do more together than to try to be divisive.
A couple of thoughts, and taking off on what Lisa just said. I think a very important principle in international relations is the ability to compartmentalize. A perfect example is within, I can't remember the exact time frame, but within months of the Russian unpleasantness in the Ukraine and the Crimea, we worked together with the Russians to get rid of Assad's chemical weapons. Couldn't have done it without them. And we've got to be able to do that. My father used to say, nobody is all bad. Even the worst person can serve as a bad example. I mean,
Okay.
but we've got to be able to find areas of where we can work together, and this, I think, can be one of them. That's number one. Number two, we need to really try to figure out what motivates and drives the Russians' activities, and particularly Putin's. I would commend to you a speech that Putin gave to the parliament, the Russian parliament, in March of 14, I think it was, right at the time of the Crimea and Ukraine business, and it's the best insight I've seen into his thinking. It's a long, 3 or 4 pages, single space, but it's a real insight into his thinking, and we've got to understand that a fundamental premise of Russian thinking is a kind of paranoia about the West. When Napoleon comes and tries to burn your capital city, and then Hitler tries to come and burn your capital city, it forms a kind of it forms a kind of thinking about the world. And I think we have to understand that, and that then put that into the context of what they're doing in the Arctic. Are they developing offensive capability to cross the Arctic and invade North America via northern Ontario and the indigenous provinces of Canada? It's unlikely. That doesn't mean that it's not a serious development, but we need to We need to try to understand it. If you don't understand Frederick the Great, you can't understand Putin. And I think that's it's always a weakness of American foreign policy, is that we're very poor at understanding what other people think about, how they think, how their culture's different. We think everyone in the world thinks like we are, kind of European linear thinking. People don't think like that. So we've got to understand Russia and what their what their motivations are. Finally, my wife says I say finally too much, it gets people's hopes up. Finally, we've got to be clear. We have to be clear with them. They have to be clear with us. Wars and conflicts generally start because of misunderstandings. I think one of the most important books written in America in the last 50 years, 100 years is The Guns of August. Barbara Tuchman studied the beginning of World War I, which was a massive misunderstanding. People didn't understand what the other person's motivations were. They didn't understand the implications of the treaties they'd entered into. And I think there has to be a clarity between us and the Russians. I almost said the Soviets. Between us and the Russians about what are your intentions here? What are you up to? Why are you doing this? And they have to understand what we're doing, because the greatest danger to world peace, in my view, is a miscalculation. I'm a recovering lawyer. The old saying in the law is that when a case goes to trial, it means that one or the other lawyers didn't understand the case. If both lawyers understand the case, they'll settle it. And we don't want to go to trial. We don't want to go to the trial of war because there's a misunderstanding. So I think compartmentalization, understanding their intentions, and being clear is one of the keys to the peaceful resolution of potential disputes in the Arctic. Also having, of course, a mechanism to resolve those disputes, like the Law of the Sea Treaty, the Arctic Council, and other kinds of international organizations.
Well, thank you both for those answers. I'm about to turn the program back to Laura Dawson, the very able head of our Canada Institute. I would point out to all of you that we have a Canada Institute. It's our oldest institute at the Wilson Center, which has done very detailed studies of Russia and the former Soviet republics over many years. 1,400 of our scholars since our founding in the late 60s come from that region, and we have real ground truth about Russia, and I appreciate your sensitive observations, Senator King. We have a new, I think, piece of swag for this emerging Polar Institute, and it will be a snow globe with an icebreaker in it.
There you go.
And so I want to thank you all and apologize for leaving early. Please welcome back Laura Dawson.
Laura, I apologize. I have an interior subcommittee hearing that I have to chair.
That's fine.
It's not as good as the blueberry
And we have
cake.
blueberry cake waiting back at the constituents. So I think I will bring this session to an appreciative close. Thank you so much for your participation and your contributions today. I think it was a great launch for what this group is going to be saying for the rest of the day. So
I'll
will
be back.
you join me in thanking this group?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, no, that was great. Oh, no.
Wait a minute.
But bring us some blueberry.
Yes, you got to bring the blueberry back.
Bring the blueberry cake. Thank you so much. Well, we've cut into your program just a little bit, but you're efficient and you're going to get it back on track. Now the real work gets done. And so I am delighted to introduce our Global Fellow for the Polar Initiative, David Biet. David is going to take you through how this program will be unrolled for the rest of the day. And I also want to thank David personally for his work on this conference and his work on the Polar Initiative. Many of you are personal friends and colleagues of David. So while we get ready for the next panel, please join me in thanking David Biet for his work on this event.
Well, thank you, Laura, and thank you, Senator Murkowski and Senator King. It was a nice opening for this program. First, I'd like to give you a little bit of background on what the Polar Initiative is. It's an umbrella program at the Wilson Center that kind of looks at what's going on in different programs. We've heard about the Kennan Institute that looks at Russia and the former Soviet Union. It covers the Canada Institute, Environmental Change and Security, even the China-US program. In that context, we look at Arctic and Antarctic issues. So within that, we're not looking at just conflict stuff. We're looking at economic development, human security, energy, transportation, and maritime issues. We did have some publications out on the little table in front. Some of them may have run out, but they are available online at our website at the Wilson Center. Polar Initiative, go to the Wilson Center and look up Polar Initiative. But with the United States currently the chair of the Arctic Council, it's more important than ever to understand that the United States is an Arctic country, as so many people have said and will say, that the Arctic affects us all in ways that we cannot imagine. The economic prosperity of the American Arctic, as well as other Arctic countries, is important to us living in more southern latitudes. So today's forum is going to take a hard look at the opportunities and barriers to economic development in the Arctic. We'll have an analysis coming up by 3 senior Arctic officials of economic conditions of peoples in the north and a look at economic policy by Arctic parliamentarians. And finally, we'll hear from people actively involved in business development in the American Arctic. We'll put it all together, and I hope you can stay for the end of the day because we'd like to synthesize these discussions so that we all can leave with some action items. We don't just want this to be a day of talk. We want to get some action out of it and what some of us can do, or even what all of us can do. I'd like to give special thanks to our partners on this forum, the Institute of the North, who did the heavy lifting, including its executive director, Nils Andreasen, and Penny Gage, its deputy director. I'd also like to thank our other partners in this program, the Senate Arctic Caucus, the Arctic Parliamentarians, the Alaska Arctic Council Host Committee, and the Arctic Economic Council. An event like this can't take place without our sponsors. You see their logos, but I would like to recognize them for their support of today's program. The Norwegian Embassy, Guggenheim Partners, GCI, General Communications, Edison Schuest Offshore, Arctic Slope Regional Corporation, Bering Straits Native Corporation, Van Ness Feldman, the North Star Group, World Affairs Councils of America, and Alaska Airlines. Now, before I introduce the next panel, in case you didn't find out, Wi-Fi codes are up on the walls here. That'll get you into the guest network so you can pull in what you need to pull in. Washrooms are down the hall, and if you do need to leave the center, don't use the stairs, use the elevators. So now I'd like to welcome the first panel up to be chaired by Tara Sweeney. Tara, as you have heard, is the Executive Vice President of the Arctic Slope Regional Corporation and the Chair of the Arctic Economics Council. We do have a sheet of biographies so that we can keep the recitation of biographies to a minimum, but next panel, come on up.
Good morning. Gail, can you hear me in the back? Okay. All right. Well, good morning. My name is Tara Sweeney. I will be moderating this panel, and I'm extremely proud to be here representing the Arctic Economic Council, and thank you to Institute of the North and the Wilson Center for hosting this wonderful event. I see many people here in the audience from different events across the Arctic, and I welcome you to the U.S. Just a brief update on the Arctic Economic Council. I'm extremely proud to report that 2 weeks ago here in D.C., our governance committee met. We adopted for approval by our delegates the foundational documents for the Arctic Economic Council, our rules of procedure, a strategic plan, and for our friends south of the Arctic, some membership terms and conditions that will be considered next week at our annual meeting in Tromsø. So just a brief update on the Arctic Economic Council. I see some members of our delegation here, Gail Schubert with Bering Straits Native Corporation and Bruce Harlan, also with Crowley as part of the AEC Alaska delegation. So thank you for that, allowing me the opportunity to indulge you on the Arctic Economic Council. So this morning, we are discussing opportunities for and barriers to Arctic economic development. To my left is Eero Hokanen with Arctia Shipping. And I apologize if I mispronounce your names. I'm Inupiaq from Barrow, and I completely understand how difficult it is at times to pronounce some names. My grandmother's maiden name is Amawak, so I challenge you on that as well. And to Eero's left is Haukur Oscarsson with Refskeg and the Icelandic Arctic Chamber of Commerce. And to my right is the Honorable Mangi Argi, Member of Parliament with the Faroese Parliament and former CEO of Atlantic Airways, and the ever-famous Mr. Felix Schutte, Chairman and owner of Schutte Shipping in Norway. Welcome. And so I introduce to you our panel. At this time, I would like to call on Eero to begin his presentation.
Thank you. I prepared a small presentation here for you, thinking about our topic here, opportunities and barriers, and then some concluding remarks. First of all, I would like to add on what the senators said, that even though we have one Arctic, but inside that one Arctic we have many regional Arctics and regional differences and aspects and environments that demand different solutions. But altogether, the conditions are universal pan-Arctic, you might say. For example, we don't even sometimes realize how some conditions and some weathers are Arctic. You know, I always get confused when people talk about, and I hear about the news of Snowzilla or something like that, you know, here on the east coast of the United States, and just a couple of inches of snow can cause big havoc. And you know that would never happen in the Nordic Arctic, you know, because that's you know everyday winter for us, and I'm still baffled on you know finding how finding the solutions to these conditions can be so hard. And you know we have a lot to do on understanding what Arctic know-how and what Arctic conditions are still. You know we should kind of see look at other regional Arctics and see the differences and help each other out. And that is what I mean with this shared Arctic conditions to shared Arctic solutions. We have winter road maintenance and anti and de-icing solutions that we can develop and use all across the Arctic. And then e-services as well. You know the distances are huge all over the Arctic, you know, Russian Arctic, Alaska, also in Lapland, in Finland, you know, people are populated, the areas are populated sparsely, and people are far and wide between. We can use e-solutions and different e-services to help those communities get along. And then a couple of words about ice breaking, already mentioned here by Senators Murkowski and King. Finland can offer a lot in terms of ice breaking. We can, you know, obviously we understand in Finland the kind of the domestic ramifications of building an iceberg and how that affects the national economy here in the United States. But we're just wanting to let important decision makers and stakeholders here to know that the world's first LNG powered iceberg, Polaris in Finland, costs about $150 million, and you have here a budget of $1.2 billion to build one heavy icebreaker. So with that money you could get five icebreakers in Finland. And obviously I understand that, you know, you have different needs for that icebreaker, but nevertheless, you know, we have experience in that regard and can build parts of icebreakers and whole icebreakers. We have 4 dockyards in Finland capable of building an icebreaker. They can build altogether 5 icebreakers per year if need be. And then it's not all about building. We can charter and timeshare. You know, chartering and timesharing is something that hasn't been discussed that much here in the US and Canada, North America yet. You know, Finland is also renewing its icebreaker fleet, and we have already good cooperation with Sweden and Russia on the Baltic Sea, and you know there's no reason for us not to consider this kind of state level solutions in icebreaking in other parts of the world as well. We could have a shared fleet of Arctic icebreakers. Here on the left you can see icebreaker Otso. Our icebreaker Otso was helping TGS in northwest Greenland last summer in seismic operations. So that's just one example of how our icebreakers operate all over the Arctic. And then research as a third option. You know, we're taking the initiative of offering our icebreakers to the international research community. We're planning an international Arctic expedition in the summer of 2017. Several research institutes also here in the US have gotten our invite, and we're hoping to get enough investing partners to make this happen. And then some words about the barriers. We can see here in the map the kind of the condition and the things that the senators talked about. Also, that the Nordic Arctic is by far the most developed when it comes to infrastructure. You know, the Norwegian coast has a lot of ports when you compare to Russia and Alaska and Greenland, and also railroad and road connections are the most developed. So even though the situations are the kind of physical situations might be different, you know, there are still solutions that can be taken out of the Nordic Arctic, you know, the most developed part of the Arctic to other parts of the Arctic, and we can kind of use those as a waypoint and help other Arctic nations as well. So my barriers are here. You know, what are the biggest barriers? I'd say market access, regulatory coherence and cooperation, and we have solutions there. TTIP and CETA negotiations are going on, and I really hope that those go along well. And then lacking or poor infrastructure, we can build on several cross-border cooperation options and public-private partnerships to develop lacking infrastructure. And then just as a general point, the climate change doesn't always mean, you know, that the conditions will get easier. For example, in icebreaking, you might think that, for example, in the Baltic Sea, the average sea ice coverage and thickness might decrease. You know, it might decrease in the coming decades, but it also means that the conditions will become more variable and more harder to predict. So that is the situation with icebreaking elsewhere in the Arctic as well. I've understood that the Great Lakes the situation is similar. So it will become harder to predict, and that's where cooperation is needed as well. You know, we can tackle these more variable and harder to predict conditions together. And there, just to conclude, some thoughts about the Finnish AEC community's views on what Finland should, what the Arctic Council should concentrate on, and the AEC should concentrate on during our chairmanship period. Kind of transforming and developing national assets into Arctic assets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eero. Harkur?
Yeah, thank you. Distinguished guests, I would like to talk about the 2 countries that I'm mainly working in, that is Iceland and Greenland. And if we take these 2 countries, we find completely different sets of barriers and opportunities. But as we have been doing for the last years, we are building a foundation for the 2 countries to engage in more business together. And there will be tremendous opportunities that if it's managed carefully, we'll see many mutual beneficial outcomes. We find a bundle of resources in these two countries. Common amongst the two countries is the natural beauty and a sustainable fish resource. However, Greenland has a world-class mineral resource, but yet a shortage of human capital. It's natural for the size of a country with it's the same size as Alaska, but only with barely 57,000 inhabitants. Iceland has developed an extensive renewable-based power grid and attracted power-intensive industry with the local human capital for running and building this industry. This is despite that the population is roughly 330,000 people. Iceland is also one of the few countries in the world with a free trade agreement with China. If we focus on the mining and mineral processing, it is easy to clearly see a complementary Greenland-Icelandic cooperation in projects. Adding to the barriers in Greenland, we have a lack of infrastructure, insufficient renewable energy. These barriers inevitably develop into the capex and the opex of the projects. On the Icelandic side, we have excellent industrial and processing infrastructure, human capital, and tremendous renewable power. However, Iceland and Greenland are nearby neighbors, and while it is eco-friendly to shorten the transport of raw materials or little processed materials, it is best to continue processing them in Iceland with the clean and inexpensive energy. Further, this enhances the allure of end products that are true catalysts to green logistics and supply chain that many companies are now demanding. We are using this model in a project that I'm working on, the rare earth mineral model project, Tambris, that we are working with Australians, Americans, and Greenlanders. I want to take you a little bit because of a success story, how a big business coming into a Arctic country. The first mega projects that came into Iceland in the 60s when Aloswiss built their first aluminium smelter in our southwest. The name has since changed to Rio Tinto. This signaled the beginning of the time employment of knowledge capital, it's including engineering, construction, and operation expertise. There was basically no Icelanders there in the beginning. Over the ensuing decades, gradually Icelanders embraced this knowledge capital and expanded upon creating a vast financial capital. So when an American named Kenneth Peterson came, his company Columbia Ventures, and he was considering to building an aluminium smelter in Iceland, he found out that the knowledge capital was already there. It just needed tuning and starting, and it worked for him. There was no longer need for engaging expensive foreign parties in the same capacity as before. This led to a greater financial capital creation. By emphasizing on the strengths, Iceland has equal to expertise of industrial specialists worldwide. Now Iceland is an expert of aluminum technique, engineering, and building smelters, for example now in Norway. Of course, this expertise must be parented with financial capital such as available here from the US. But this story shows how a mega project JV with the local population has over long periods of time led to success. This was mainly done by taking the project into smaller work packages that are manageable for the local service providers. In the new harbor project in Greenland, in Sikuki Harbor in Greenland, we did it a little bit differently. Greenland government has had a wish for a local involvement, but we put it in the contract, and now the project was a success in that there has never been as much local contact in a Greenland project as in this one. That is the building of the new harbor in Nuuk, Greenland, here on the left-hand side. But But the barriers and threats for a pan-Arctic economical development is frankly that the projects are in many cases unrealistic. The reason is mainly high capex. Another threat is an unstable political environment. Ever-changing rules and regulations for taxation, environmental rules, and slow official system. However, these are very avoidable barriers with the employment of more disciplined governmental systems. And finally, there are projects in the Arctic that are feasible and give boost to economical development in the area. They can and are pan-Arctic. They can transfer knowledge and they can make competitive, specialized, economical, local know-how. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments at this time.
Sorry?
At the podium, we have the Honorable Mangi Arni, Member of Parliament for the Faroese Parliament.
Just a second.
Well, the second is gone. Thank you very much for having me here. I have to make 3 confessions. First one, I'm here as a substitute for a beautiful Greenlandic woman called Aya Chemenitz. She is an honorable member of the Danish Parliament, and she should have been here today and explaining you about the Greenlandic view. I am from the Faroe Islands, for mine will be more of a male Faroese view instead. Secondly, I'm not a member of the Arctic Economic Forum, and for that reason, I'm not that experienced in this matter. Thirdly, I spent 30 years in business, and that was a business life within aviation, with tourism, with various other topics like oil and things like that. And during my presentation over the years, I rarely put any trust in politicians, being anything but dreamers. And now I am a lawmaker myself, because I was elected to 2 parliaments last summer, both the Faroese Parliament and the Danish Parliament. So this is a pretty special one. Well, I have taken the opportunity to tell you something about the Faroe Islands, which I have called a nation in the Arctic. Faroe Islands is about here, as you can see. You could call it's in the northern periphery and it's on the doorstep of the Arctic. It is a very tiny rocky island of 1,400 square kilometers above sea level, but our fishery zone is 280,000 square kilometers, and our continental shelf is 310,000 square kilometers. So it's approximately 10% of us is north of the Arctic Circle, and we are definitely a nation completely dependent on harvest from the sea. We are the children of the sea, you may say. The marine environment is our daily environment, and it is in our veins. We've done pretty well over the past few years. Our GDP per capita now is about $40,000, which is round about the same level as it is in the Nordic countries. And I dare say that we definitely belong to the part of the Arctic that you could call the North Arctic. Faroe Islands was inhabited around about 750. There came Norse Vikings over here. There came Norse Vikings from Ireland and Scotland as well. They used the Faroes as a stepping stone to go further on west. It was actually a Faroese chieftain called Nadodr who discovered Iceland. And it is said that when Leif the Lucky from Iceland claimed that he went all the way over to America more than 1,000 years ago, he sailed in the keel water of Nadodr. So, ladies and gentlemen, it was a Faroe Islander who discovered America. And now, what happened over the Middle Ages, it was a pretty dark time of our society. We were only 5,000 people living there. We had gone back on shore, trying to make a life out of walking on the cliffs or on the hillside. It was not very prosperous. So, About 1,000 years after Nadoder left for America, we started a new Arctic pioneering adventure. And that was going fishing, firstly under sail back in the 1870s, 1880s. We went especially to Iceland and were fishing around the Icelandic coast. We then went further on from Iceland to the west of Greenland in 1906, still sailing under sail. In the 20s, we were in the Newfoundland area. We then went further north to the Bear Island, up to the Svalbard and to the Barents Sea. And that's part of where we actually have made our fortune in the past 100 years, now sailing with pretty modern ships, you could say. So our economy has very largely been based upon fishery. But now, in the very recent time, the last 20 years or so, we've developed also fish farming, and we've been extremely successful in fish farming as well. We've got our downtimes 2 or 3 times where we more or less got ruined, but now we are up and running again and actually producing the very best salmon you can get in the world. It's even better than the one from Norway. And you are paying $4 more per kilo in the US for Faroe salmon. We believe that we in the salmon also can further develop opportunities in the Faroes. Salmon has actually grown over the past 10 years to become 50% of our export value today. It came from 5% or something like that 10, 15 years ago. So it's a huge adventure, you could say. But there will also be other species to be farmed in the future, such as seaweed, which we can discuss later if there will be time for it. But the Faroes is more than that. We have also developed a high social welfare, we have a good educational system, and we also have good medical care. But the educational system has also led to us having a workforce which is very highly valued for their competence, especially within the maritime field, and also for their flexibility. And for that reason, almost 7% of our workforce has worked internationally, globally, in oil industry, in marine shipping industry, and also in the fishing industry all around the globe. Developing infrastructure and focusing on a blue-green future. What you can see here is a subsea tunnel. Faroes consists of 18 islands. We've built 2 subsea tunnels, and with tunnels and bridges, we've connected most of the islands, 80% of our landmass and 80% of our population, into one road system. And it's a fantastic advance of our society that we've been able to do that. At the same time, we've also developed the air infrastructure and are flying aircraft with the very best technology to help us lifting up the regularity of our flights. And we have daily connections to Denmark, for instance, twice a day. We have also developed a hub system for cargo ships coming from Iceland via the Faroes to Europe. And we have become a hub for Russian fishery in the North Atlantic as well. But above all, I think we should also mention that we have 4G network in the Faroe Islands, and we have cable connections from Faroes to Iceland, we have cable connections from Faroes to Scotland, from Faroes to Denmark. So we have a fabulously good infrastructure, and that is helping us very much, providing the local people with a lot of opportunities. Let's look at some opportunities and challenges. The world needs food. In 2050, there will be 10 billion people who need food. And we should optimize harvest from the sea. And we should do more about farming fish and seaweed. That is definitely an area to exploit, and definitely an area where we have something to offer and where we can help both mankind and also create a sustainable future for ourselves. We should invest in renewable energy, which we've done in the Faroes just recently with a windmill park, which is doing extremely well. And we should utilize our strategic location to develop infrastructure, which is why we are offering now Faroe Islands as a maritime service center. Then there was action point on a serious barrier which I want to share with you. Sustainable harvest from the sea for people in the Arctic includes all marine life, and it is fundamental to our welfare now and in the future. The urban approach to this is quite different from the Arctic approach, because that's about animal welfare in a distant world, and it has little impact on their welfare. So I think we need to define clearly what sustainable harvest from the sea means in an Arctic context, and we should include it in the Arctic Protocol and expect observers to respect it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the presentation of Faroe Islands transforming an Arctic rock to a vibrant maritime society.
Well, I'm glad to see that competition is alive and well in the Nordic countries, but I would like to remind you that we also have wild Alaska salmon. See all of my Alaskan friends in the audience looking up here with the look of reminding me to advocate for wild Alaska salmon. Next up is Mr. Felix Schutte with Schutte Shipping Company.
Thank you, Tara. As you are our leader, and as I'm one who follows the leader, and you asked me some questions, you sent some questions, I've actually chosen that I will respond to your questions.
Sure.
So I read those and then try to respond. And for once, I will not use a lot of slides. So your first question, Tara, was what opportunities do you foresee as economic opportunities in your country? And as Northern Norway and the Kola Peninsula are ice-free, like an ice-free wedge into the Arctic due to the Gulf Stream. Of course, what we see is that it can serve very, very well, that area of the Arctic can serve very well as a platform for serving other needs for transportation and logistics in other parts of the Arctic which are less accessible. So that's an important part, and that's a you say a geographic fact which is determining that. Of course, as we have heard, there's a large potential for fisheries and agriculture, and of course that potential is moving north due to the warming of the seas. And this is we see it happening as we speak, and it will be very large, as you described, because of the demographic development of the world and so on. And then a third point, which I think is very interesting for the Arctic as a whole, but of course maybe lends itself at this time the best for the Barents Sea and the Russian and for that sake Norwegian parts of it, is the fact that the Arctic is an area where gas meets ore. It's an area where you have all around the rim there is oil and gas, and on shore there are minerals and metals. And of course we have traditionally been the exporters of the raw materials themselves as commodities, which are prone to the fluctuations of the markets and so on. And we believe that there's a huge potential for the Arctic, and not least for in this case for the Nordic countries and for Russia in the Barents Sea, to combine the gas with the minerals and metals, which means that we industrially process the minerals and metals on site. It reduces transportation. It's an environmentally good way of processing minerals and metals, because gas is better than coal and coke. And of course what it does is that it raises the general competence level in the areas. A little bit like what was discussed or described by Haukur, is that by doing it on site in the place with the people who are there, over time you build up competence and you get your own momentum. And of course you have also the advantage that semi-processed products are much less vulnerable to the fluctuations of the markets, because they're high margins, and that's important because markets are fluctuating a lot, and if you are producing in a very expensive place, you're very easily thrown off. You are out of business. And of course, for the Arctic as such, we are, from a transportation point of view, placed much closer to the Asian markets, at least during the ice-free periods, which means that you have a short time to market, and for that sake, lower emission transportation. Second question, what pan-Arctic opportunities to see within your industry? And I think within our business, which is logistics and maritime transportation, we see the need for companies and nations joining forces, sharing, like you were pointing towards. I mean, this is really, I think, the name of the game for the Arctic. Using the resources, using the facilities, using the services, using the skills jointly, somehow. Much easier said than done. But It can also, one way of facilitating that is to create infrastructure which is serving the needs of more. It could be serving the needs of more companies, sharing the same infrastructure in the, for example, for storage of oil and transshipment of oil in the Norwegian Barents Sea. There could be one big facility serving a number of oil companies. Or it can, and I think even that would be even more efficient, but more complicated, also be serving infrastructure across borders, which I think is the name of the game going forward. Your third question, what do you see as barriers to economic development in your country? It was pointed out before, I think we all have the same problems. It is really about unpredictable timelines. It's about the fact that it's the lack of political predictability with regard to the planning processes. The Arctic is not different from any other region when it comes to the necessity of creating a framework which is conducive to business. And predictability and stability is the prerequisite for economic growth. Uncertainty stops all initiatives even before they start. And in particular in the Arctic, where development costs are so high and difficult, if there is uncertainty related to timelines or to what approvals are needed or the regulatory framework, the decisions, the decision makers will say, well, let's go for some other place. I think this is absolutely crucial, and we have a number of examples of them, not least here in the US, but also in Norway and everywhere else. But it requires that politicians and other decision makers are informed and realistic. Your fourth question, what do you consider a barrier to pan-Arctic economic development in your country? Today, of course, it was mentioned during the first session, of course, the political sanctions against Russia is a major impediment at the moment. We all know it's a fact of life, and they're not taking any position, but that is it's a big negative. But Russia is playing such a big role in the Arctic, and it has such a huge part of the coastline and the resources. I also think that that doesn't go only for Norway, but it goes for every Arctic nation, I think. I think it's extremely important to try to avoid uninformed and quite often unwarranted non-Arctic influence on decisions guiding the rules affecting the Arctic. And those views are often based on lack of knowledge, they're based on myths, often. And I think it's very, very important that we continue to focus on science to find out what is real, what's real issues, what are the real issues and what are the myths, and that we're communicating these results. I mean, it's really important to avoid the myths and focus on the real issues, because of course there are real issues. But those who are uninformed and from outside the Arctic does not have the same need to be sure that we choose the important issues and that we can get things done. 5, what should policymakers and thought leaders incorporate into their discussions to attract capital for micro, small and medium businesses located in the Arctic? I mean, you're pointing to the right thing. The main challenge is that the Arctic needs investments and job opportunities in order to retain and keep the coming generations of Arctic inhabitants in the Arctic. If not, it will be serene but empty. So, and this goes for both indigenous people and, of course, the non-indigenous people populations of the Arctic. So we have to focus on investments. So what can make investments possible, and what are the government's obligations? In my view, the main obligation is really infrastructure. That's always been the government's obligations. Infrastructure, physical, but also, of course, in terms of predictable regulations and it's a sort of regulatory infrastructure. Infrastructure is so important because it is a catalyst for activity, and it's a necessary condition for any development. For example, a shipping line along the serving the Arctic ports, of course, will serve certain businesses, which probably are the ones asking or requiring these services. But of course, it will also lower the cost of starting any other activity in the area. So the moment you have the infrastructure in terms of a shipping line or serving ports, you have raised the potential for value creation for the whole area. Large examples of such infrastructure is, of course, could be a link between the Barents Sea and Europe via Finland, via an extension of the railway lines there, which again is, government responsibilities, but it will be paid for by increased taxes over time, and of course that the users of this infrastructure should pay for it, but they can't pay it all up front, because then it will never happen. It will have to happen over time, just like any other infrastructure we have had in the rest of the world. And I think then it comes to the investment side of it. It's, it requires financing. I think it's so important that these investments are guided by proper guidelines. I think the initiative taken by the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the Arctic on establishing an Arctic investment protocol, which was launched in Davos this year, is very important. And I think the longer term of that initiative, or the longer term goal of that initiative, is to establish an Arctic permanent investment vehicle which could work across borders in the Arctic. I think others will talk more about that later today. So the last point, your last question, what does good Arctic stewardship mean to you, your organization, your industry? And I think it's very important that sustainability, which is of course a core term in whatever we do in the Arctic, it's not only environmental, but it's also economic. I mean, you have to have you have to have economically sustainable activity, which means that you take care of the environment as well. And we had to strike that balance. And of course, we must have no accidents, because that's very detrimental to every stakeholder. And I think most stakeholders really, really understand that. And something going really wrong in the Arctic will have major negative implications for everyone. And at the same time, we must also realize that activity creates activity. So when you introduce more ships to the Arctic, offshore vessels in the Arctic, the same will happen in the Arctic as happened in the North Sea. Certainly, by having more ships available, if there is a coordination around, you raise the level of emergency response capacity. You are better prepared for search and rescue, and so on. So there is, if the increased economic activity is organized and put to use in the right way, this is a part of the stewardship, in fact. So I think with these words, I will leave the floor to the questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So this morning we've heard our panelists describe some of the barriers as market access, regulatory certainty or uncertainty, an unstable political environment, the need for infrastructure, defining what sustainable harvests mean, and the high cost of doing business in the Arctic. And those are significant barriers, yet barriers that by working together we can overcome. And as some of the opportunities were highlighted, local involvement, capacity building with the eyes of the world looking north, there certainly is an opportunity to build capacity in our smallest communities to provide services to the world. And I'm reminded of a presentation that was provided at the Arctic Futures Conference in Brussels earlier this year, or late last year, and it highlighted for me the amazing capabilities inside the Faroe Islands with respect to telecommunication. And there was a presentation made about a gentleman who services large companies like Microsoft from his basement in the Faroe Islands. And what he does is he designs airports for flight simulation programs for a number of tech firms, which was amazing. The fact that you were so remote and yet extremely connected. A gentleman from his basement could, in fact, build a business. And when you look at communities, especially in northern Alaska and in Canada, where we face similar circumstances of complete remote communities with no road transportation and the need for telecommunications infrastructure, there are opportunities for building that capacity at the local level. Another of the opportunities raise regional hubs and optimizing the food harvest from the sea. I think we can all agree on that. Natural resource development, science and building science capacity, and also investment and job opportunities as some of the opportunities highlighted throughout your presentations. So at this time, I know that I had sent a list of questions to the panelists, and Felix, thank you. Yes, you did a great job. But I would like to ask our other panelists, what Pan-Arctic opportunities do you see within Iceland and within Finland and Faroe Islands? And I'll start with you, Mange.
You start with me. I think that we can look at, for instance, how we've been working together in what we could call the Arctic North. It's between the Norwegian, the Faroes, Iceland, and Greenland, with investment program under a name called NORA. And we would also, and that is projects where we are entering into cooperation between entities in all 4 countries. For instance, I'm chairman of a company which is actually leading in developing seaweed farming in Europe. And that includes also collaboration with entities in Iceland, in Norway, in Holland, and elsewhere. And we then share the results that we gain out of this, and we hope to also to be able to have a commercial cooperation in the future about developing this new business. This is one type of cooperation which works well. In the Faroes, they also started now to work out new education at a higher level, a master education in West Nordic and Arctic management, which is a cooperation between Tromsø and Faroe Islands and Accrue in Iceland, and I think also Nuuk in Greenland, which is again a kind of opening the idea of looking upon us as being not only a remote location, but being a very interesting place to operate in, also for our young new people who are very well educated, because normally we are actually in a sort of a competition with the urban continental places in Europe and some places also in the US, and with us who are living here in these remote locations. But if we are educating people, working together on this, showing what possibilities that are in this, we will create innovation and seeing what prosperous possibilities that are. Those are things I think which will help in creating a better future for all of us in this region. And if you are looking at also in various branches like aviation, for instance, there will always be a very interesting outcome of meeting for seeing how we can put on best practices for aviation in the Arctic area, for instance. And there will be other opportunities as well.
Thank you. Harku?
As I mentioned before, if we take apart from the mining that I've already mentioned, and what Mr. King was mentioning, for example, in the logistic chain, that what has been developed between Iceland, Faroes, and now with Maine, and now also with the new, for example, the new infrastructure in Nuuk, in Greenland, that now there will be a possibility for fleet sharing, something that you came with, on the Greenlandic side. This hasn't been up to now been a political will or what for whatever reasons, but now there will be an infrastructure for a fleet sharing opportunities on the North Atlantic, including Greenland. So that is one of the possibilities that I see, and I would also put a more emphasis on it that has been through the years between Norway and Iceland on the mining and metal processing. And that model is what we want to use in the Greenlandic also. So this is, and also on the tourist side. Now in Iceland we have had a tremendous, what we call a explosion in the tourism, coming from 10 years ago about 200,000 to 1.7 million tourists this year into the country. Do you know which country in the world has, in Europe, has the most tourists? France. They have a population of 63 million, and they have 83 million tourists, 1.3 times. In Iceland, we are 330,000. We are 5.3, the population of the country. So these new plans that the Greenlandic government has with the 3 big airports on the west coast, and the vast natural beauty of Greenland, for example, is if they can tap only into this system, it will not only give them more economical growth, but lift a little bit of the pressure of us. So that is also a possibility. So it will be a great location. Coming to Iceland, you have a urban society, you can have nice restaurants and nightlife and everything, and then you can go on a day trip to Greenland or a few days where you're totally alone. So that is a good combination. So these are some of the possibilities that I foresee.
Okay. I believe you when you talk about the numbers in Iceland. We were holding our strategic planning session in Reykjavik in February, and the capacity rate at your hotels was running at 97%.
Yeah, it's more than London.
It was very difficult to get a room for 2 nights at the same place. Yeah. And to you, Eero.
Thank you, Tara. I'd like to grasp an important issue that Mr. Judy raised, and that is safety. We have at the moment 2 internationally binding agreements negotiated under the auspices of the Arctic Council, and those are the agreement on oil spill preparedness and response and the agreement on search and rescue. And these are two things that are both kind of related to icebreaking as well. Those can be done with icebreakers, and out of the 110 or so icebreakers in the world today, I don't think that many have been equipped with oil spill preparedness and response equipment. We could and we should equip more icebreakers with those equipment and have them serve as a kind of reserve for those operations as well. And I know that search and rescue is organized differently in each Arctic nation, but there are opportunities on not having all of those in kind of the same hands. I mean that with the shared fleet we could do more in this respect as well. We have now the first the first tourist vessel, the Crystal Serenity, or what was the name, going through the Northwest, or planning to go through the Northwest Passage this summer. And at least to me, that raises questions. We had 2 of our icebreakers, Nordica and Fennica, going through the Northwest Passage not long ago, a couple of months ago, and there was nothing coming from the the Alaskan coast to all the way to Nuuk and Northwest Passage. That is really in the middle of nowhere. There's no infrastructure there to kind of be a guide and waypoint and way forward and for safety. So building kind of that safety infrastructure is key, I think.
Thank you. We have about 5 more minutes before the break, and would like to open it up for questions for the panel. Yes.
Sorry.
Okay, if I
Don't stand up. I pulled my back out the other day. But I'm trying to pick up a little bit on this discussion about regulatory coherence and regulatory harmonization. And I'm wondering if there's been or there might be any effort for, let's say, the Arctic Economic Council to work a little bit with the Regulators Forum, because very often industry has a lot of competence that policymakers need or don't have, and often you have these ideas about government oversight of industry-led standards and this type of thing. And so there seems to be a lot of need for collaboration between the two. And maybe if someone can clarify or expand a little bit on maybe the relationship even between the Arctic Economic Council, the Regulators Forum, the Arctic Council, and how there might be a space in there to have better collaboration amongst those entities.
So that's a great question, and there are many layers to that question. And I believe the next panel certainly can answer from the Arctic Council's perspective. What I can provide for you is some insight into the Arctic Economic Council and the efforts there. We do have members of our delegation that are working in conjunction with Rumble and Kaisa Consulting to do a comparative analysis of the regulatory structure throughout the Arctic. And they continue to do that work, and we're hopeful that soon it will produce some results so that we can take a look at what those regulatory structures are throughout the Nordic Arctic, throughout the North American Arctic and Russian Arctic, so we can begin to make decisions on strategy and how we work together within those structures and what those barriers may be and how we can alleviate some of that pressure. Mm-hmm. Yes.
So my name is Elsebeth Eikeland. I'm Norway Senior Arctic. Yeah, thank you. Good morning. I just wanted to answer the question on the Regulators Forum because it was initiated by the Arctic Council, and it's mainly a forum for exchange of technical standards between the regulators in the countries with oil and gas offshore production. At the time being, it's only Russia and Norway producing offshore oil and gas, very limited in Alaska. And it's not a forum for communication with industry. As you know, oil and gas is national regulated. It's not part of the Arctic Council cooperation. And because it's huge differences when it comes to performance and conditions. So from the Norwegian perspective, we do not see a contact with industry in a regulators forum. It's purely technical exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you. Eero,
Just really shortly, thank you, Tara. And Tara can correct me if I'm wrong, but kind of the purpose of creating the Arctic Economic Council and the rationale behind it is that it could at some point, perhaps not now, but at some point be a kind of voice of industry, a voice of Arctic business also towards the Arctic Council and the lawmakers and the regulators, and that is certainly something that we should develop and have AEC representatives perhaps somewhere in the future in Arctic Council working groups as experts.
thank you. Ma'am, right behind Nils.
Thank you. Hi, Monique Baskin, I'm CNAS Fellow at NOAA. So I'm just wondering, what are some of your thoughts on, or what are some of the thoughts of natives or indigenous populations and communities with regard to economic development and what they would like to see in their communities, if you have any?
Well, as a native, good Arctic stewardship. As you've heard from the panelists here, the ocean and the land define who we are as Arctic residents. It also puts food on our tables, and it contributes to our economy. So those that are coming up to do business in the Arctic, it's imperative that they are good Arctic stewards. The people sitting on this panel and in this room who are Arctic residents certainly understand the importance of the environment, but there also needs to be responsible economic growth and development in our communities. The first flush toilet I had was when I turned 16. And that's growing up in Barrow, as Senator Murkowski was talking about earlier. And the development that took place in my community certainly changed an entire generation the opportunities available to our people. So good Arctic stewardship and involvement in those projects. But at the same time, I would like to give the panelists an opportunity to provide input as well.
Yeah, it's like we said that the people who are coming, the investors, who are coming into these communities, investigate what knowledge base and what human capital is there to help and develop the projects. Because in the long run, it will give, only talking economically, lower capex to have the local people doing the operation instead of having expats fly in and out all the time. So that is it is a sense to it makes sense to the communities, to the people, and also to the business case.
Felix?
I just think it's, and of course, it's on the indigenous people themselves, and not only the indigenous people. It's also all those who live in the Arctic, who are in the same situation. Is that if there is no economic activity, if there are no jobs, if there is no future, everyone chooses to go south. And that is, I think, the sad truth. And therefore, I believe, when I'm traveling or meeting people, I think everyone has the same goal. Ultimate goal is development. Of course, it's how it's happening, and that's about stewardship. It's about the guidelines, the rules guiding this, and that there is an common understanding of how that should be done. But I don't think there's many who do not want to see any kind of development, because they know that that's the end of their society.
Yeah, I fully agree with the view put forward here, and it is very important that people are not looking upon the Arctic region as a certain museum for people to come and watch, and that it will remain the same, just like the Antarctica has been an ambition to do. I mean, the Arctic is a dynamic region with 4 million people living there, and these people, they all want to have an improved welfare, just like everybody else in the world does. So for that reason, we need to develop this region. And of course, we need to be very cautious, because we need to do it in a sustainable way. We are not only going to live today and tomorrow, but also our kids and our sons and daughters should remain there in 20, 30, 40 years. So we need to create both opportunities for them to get jobs and an interesting life, and also a sustainable life where you are taking good care of the environment you're part of. We all know this, I mean, because we all come from nature, if I may say so. Huh? So this is part of our daily life. This is not necessarily things that we have to go to university to understand. And for that reason, there is quite a difference between the attitude people who are grown up in this mother nature, if I may say, have to sustainable harvest from the sea, for instance, compared to people who have never been dependent upon this harvest like we do. So it's extremely important, I think, that we address this issue. So politicians in continental Europe and continental America, for instance, also recognize it's not only about the voters who are thinking about protecting animals that count for them, because if they also put emphasis on the development in the Arctic region, you have to look at what is the likelihood for us to survive and to be able to develop if we cannot harvest from the sea.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. One more question? Sure. Or, yeah. Another point, just in closing, when you look at remote communities, especially in Alaska and in northern Canada, connectivity, telecommunications infrastructure is going to be absolutely key to developing very remote economies. And it's something that is needed, and it will help build capacity in our communities. So with that, I would like to thank the panelists here for joining us this morning. And again, thank you to the Wilson Center and Institute of the North.
Thank you. Good. Yeah. Mrs.
And as your official timekeeper, I'd like to invite you to coffee refreshments out in the atrium, and we'll be back here for 10:45, and I will have the microphone guys shoo you in. So thank you very much.